Well, hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm going to keep the upfronts very quick on this one because I've been doing some day drinking with Record Store Phil, and I'm not sure how much longer I could actually hold this microphone. This week, we have a second episode of the Vinyl Guide podcast, this one featuring Paul Gray, who you may know from The Damned, the Eddie and the Hot Rods. He played with UFO, Johnny Thunders, and more. He's a key figure in the UK punk scene, served with many bands, and Paul is going to be talking today about all those times, the record label frenzy, moving from the Hot Rods to the Damned, recording the Black Album, eventually up to present day, and not only has a new Damned EP, but also the album Séance from Professor and the Madman, the punk rock supergroup featuring Paul, Sean Elliott, Rat Scabies, and Alfie Agnew. Now, the album Séance is out this week. You can head over to professorandthemadman.com. They have limited vinyl pressings, there's some colored vinyl, there's even a deluxe package that comes with a special Professor and the Madman board game. It's all there at professorandthemadman.com. By the way, this is the second episode of the Vinyl Guide this week. Actually, the third. If you are a member of our patreon.com/Vinyl Guide community, you even got an extra episode in there as well. So to access the conversation we had with Rat Scabies around Professor and the Madman and the Damned reunion, head over to patreon.com/Vinyl Guide. Sign up. You get access to all sorts of extended interviews, secret episodes, bonus stuff, not to mention you're helping support this podcast and keeping my belly full of cheap burritos, so I keep making the interviews for vinyl record nerds everywhere. That's patreon.com/Vinyl Guide. Sign up, help support this show, and we will be eternally grateful. And by the way, a quick shout out to show sponsor GrooveWasher.com. Nothing will make your equipment last longer and your records hold their value more than if you clean them regularly. So get the best record cleaner in the world, the Groove Washer. Ask for the Groove Washer by name at your local record shop, or simply go to GrooveWasher.com and use discount code VinylGuide10 for a discount at checkout. That's the best record cleaner in the history of the universe, the Groove Washer. GrooveWasher.com, promo code VinylGuide10. And we're also brought to you today by AudiofileUSA.com, the used online record shop that only sells excellent and near-mint vinyl records. AudiofileUSA.com has nearly 50,000 titles in stock, and they ship worldwide. Wherever you're at, they'll get the very best records directly to your doorstep. Head over to AudiofileUSA.com now and search their inventory for your holy grails. Tons of great records over at AudiofileUSA.com. Alrighty, and that's it for the upfronts. Let's get into this week's interview with UK punk legend Paul Gray. Hey, there he is.
How you doing?
I'm doing good, man. How are you?
I was going to say the sun's out in sunny Wales, but it isn't. It's cold and wet and raining.
That's pretty typical, though, I believe.
It's pretty typical of Wales, yeah. There we go. I wouldn't have it any other way, really.
Well, man, it's great to hear from you. I hope you're well. Are you healthy these days? You doing all right physically?
Yeah, I seem to be in pretty rude health. You know, I look after myself a bit more than I did back in the old days. Mm-hmm. You've got to do it, haven't you? So, yeah, you know, do lots of cycling, do lots of walking through the hills here and everything, and knocked all the sugar on the head pretty much.
Well, that sounds like you're doing really well. Sounds like you're in fighting shape.
Yeah, almost. I wish I could say I was stage fit, but I wouldn't know that until we actually get back on a blimmin' stage again.
Oh, well, I hope that day is very soon. Look, I've been enjoying this new LP from Professor and the Madman. I just spoke to Rat as well. He's quite proud of it too. So you got a nice album here to share.
There you go. Yeah, the guy's really putting out the hat, eh?
Absolutely. And I want to talk all about this album because I like the whole Professor and the Madman catalog, going back to Disintegrate and even Live at the 100 Club. So we're going to go through that. But First off, since this is a vinyl podcast and we talk about record collecting and rare records and such, do you have a record collection?
I do have a record collection. It's not been added to for many a year because I kept all the records that are most dear to me. Like everybody, I've moved a dozen times, during the course of my lifetime. So stuff has disappeared and been flogged and given away and all of that. But I have a core record collection of singles and albums that I do play regularly. And I'm a bit of a creature of habit, Nate. I tend to go back to the same stuff all the time. So I've still got the records that I grew up with. I've still got the records that I played absolutely to death and are barely playable to this day that I played over and over and over and over again in my bedroom when I was standing in front of the mirror, getting the look right, getting the shapes right when I was 12 and 13 and trying to figure out what on earth the bass was doing. So I have still got pretty much all of that stuff. I think when the touring stuff really kicked in, 30, 40 years ago, I tended to stop buying vinyl just because I didn't really have the time. And I just kept going back to revisit the stuff that I've always loved, really.
And what were those records? The records that you mimed in front of the mirror? What are the ones that you played to death?
Well, the first two albums I bought, the very first one, I can't remember what the first, it was one or rather these two. The Kingsmen's Greatest Hits with Little Latin Loopy Lou and Louie Louie on it. And I bought it because it had a picture of a red guitar on it. And I just thought it looked really, really cool. And the second album was by a British rock and roll group called the Wild Angels, called Red Hot and Rockin'. And I bought that because it had a picture of the band on the front of it. And the guitarist had a curly lead. And I thought the curly lead was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. That's why I bought the record. And of course, after that, I went out and bought a curly lead for myself.
You thought, this guy has it all. He's in a band. And
that's it. That's all you need to make it, man. You just need a curly lead and a red guitar.
So eventually you got one of each of those things. In terms of the records, were those the ones that made you want to play music?
They were the one that first kind of piqued my interest. Mm-hmm. I think the ones that wanted me to actually play the bass, there was a couple of records. Well, actually, there was a lot of records. But one of the first ones that I can really remember pricking my ears up and thinking, what on earth is that galloping away in the background? And it was by an English group called Love Affair. Mm-hmm. And in the late 60s, they had a raft of just perfect 2-minute, 50-second pop records called Everlasting Love and A Day Without Love, Rainbow Valley. Had a fantastic singer. And they managed to encapsulate absolutely perfect choruses, really memorable soaring choruses with great string arrangements, brass, really great kind of pushy vocals, incredible galloping bass line that I actually found out how it was done. I asked Tony Visconti when he was doing our record a couple of years ago, hey, Tony, do you know how this bass sound was got? And he said, sure. He said, it's a Rickenbacker bass with the dampers tightened up on the bridge, which basically muffles the strings and make it much more clacky. And I kind of always suspected that, and he confirmed it. And then it was the groups like, I bought all the Black Sabbath stuff and Deep Purple. And as a bass player, hearing that wonderful sound that Roger Glover got out of his, Rickenbacker bass, and then Chris Squire. And then the band that really did it was Hawkwind. And I've got all their records right from the start. And there's an album called Space Ritual. I don't know whether you know.
Yeah. That's the double album, right? The fold-out one?
That's right. Concept album. And I went to see them a couple of months after I bought the album. And I bought it just because all their covers were just wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I was right in the front of this sort of cavernous venue in Southend where I grew up. I was 13 years old. And I was right in front of the bass player, Lemmy, although I didn't know that was, where he was going to be. And he had a Rickenbacker bass as well. And the sounds that thing created, together with all the other atmospherics that, the band as a whole did, that was my key to another world from dull South End suburbia where everybody kind of mowed their lawns at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, then had their roast beef and then washed their cars. The thought of that all my life was just horrific. And Hawkwind was my key to it. And all those, all the glam rock stuff, I was lucky. Growing up, being born in 58 as I was a great time, I think, to grow up as an English person, because you had, you were aware of all the late kind of 60s pop and psychedelic stuff. Then you had all that great glam rock stuff with Sweet and Slade and T-Rex. Again, perfect 3-minute pop songs with just a great sound. And then you had all those great rock bands, the ones that I mentioned. I didn't really know much of the American stuff at the time. That came a bit later. The Stooges, the Dolls, the MC5, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a really, really good time to grow up, because so many different musical styles happen in a relatively short window, perhaps over 6 years or so.
And they seem to have really culminated into a style which seems to be very well exemplified by Eddie and the Hot Rods.
When I joined Eddie and the Hot Rods, they were like a breath of fresh air. There was a band called Dr. Feelgood, who, you'll know of. And they were the ones that kind of blew all the prog rock stuff away. And some of the prog rock stuff I really liked, but I did get a bit bored with the kind of the triple albums and the pictures of people playing on foot-high Persian rugs and everything. Wasn't really that exciting to 13, 14-year-old. Mm-hmm. And, it was a bit like going to, you might as well stay at home and put your headphones on, listen to the record, because it was all absolutely perfect. And the Feelgoods came along in England. They got back into the pubs and clubs, and music had kind of morphed more into the big venues, the Stadia, with the likes of Genesis and ELP and Yes and all of that. Mm-hmm. And they kind of reinvigorated the pub and club circuit and brought their brand of rock and roll and R&B back to the masses, and back to, kids of my age that thought, that is doable. I don't have to be a virtuoso musician to be able to play that. Look at Brillo. Look at that guitarist. Look at that bass player doing backflips while still playing. That was kind of really, really exciting. And they were the catalyst to the whole kind of new wave punk thing. And our guitarist, Dave Hicks and the Hot Rods, had been a band with Brillo and Spark and Wilco, a few years previously, Jug Band on Canvey Island where he lived. And when I went to audition for them, he was in the Feelgoods house. They had a house on Canvey Island. And I'd never been in a band before. And I went along with my 3/4 size Fender copy guitar in a battered old cardboard box, being given a lift by my dad because I was still 16. I remember going in, and there was like 4 or 5 other guys before me waiting to audition, all with shiny Fenders in shiny cases, kind of like I could almost see them. Well, I imagine them sort of sneering down their noses at me. Who is this kid think he is? A cardboard box. I got really paranoid. I just wanted this sort of big hole to come and open me up. I just want the audition to be over as quickly as possible. I never thought I'd get it. And when I did, and I sort of said to guys, fantastic, but why have you chosen me rather than the other guys? Because I could hear what they were playing through the wall, and I've never been in a group before, and obviously they have. And they said, it's all about the spirit. And that's always stuck with me. To this day, it's all about the spirit. I don't worry about making mistakes. They don't bother me. It's the spirit that really, really matters. And if you can get that spirit and that connection over to people, I think that's a great thing. And with the Hot Rods, because they only had one guitarist at the time, there was a lot of room for me to play. Some bass players might say overplay.
Mm-hmm. A lot of space to fill.
Yeah, to fill in the gaps, which is kind of what I did. So again, I was very lucky being in the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. And that was just in advance of what then became termed the punk movement. But, we must remember that elements of the Damned, Rat Captain, Brian, Chrissy Hine, the Stranglers, all these people were kind of already playing in some shape or other, some form or another. They just hadn't actually got together in their respective bands. So it was all going on for a couple of years before some journalist, it might have been Nick Kent, it might have been Caroline Coon, kind of termed this phrase punk, that then kind of morphed into being one of maybe a dozen different sorts of music. To me, it was all rock and roll, and it always has been all rock and roll. It's all three chords at the end of the day, right?
Did you imagine at the time, did you realize that something new and interesting was happening, or did it just seem like a bunch of random occurrences? No movement there.
Do you know what? That's a really good question. And I've asked myself this a lot of times over the years. When you're in the heart of it, when you're in that vortex of everything happening, it kind of, you don't actually notice what's happening. You're not sitting back and taking an objective view of it. You're less an observer. You're more a facilitator. And I certainly didn't really realize quite what was happening because I and the guys in the Hot Rods were too busy doing it. You know, we were doing the pubs and then the clubs 5, 6, 7 nights a week, drive in 6 hours to do a show up in North Yorkshire, leaving at 2 a.m, driving back, breaking down. And the guys would go to their jobs as petrol pump attendants and roofers and dustbin men. And I just left school. I didn't have a job. So I was totally tied up into what the band were doing. And it was really only probably actually when I first saw the Dam play at the Hope and Anchor, some maybe 6 months later, that I realised, God, there's really is something else going on here. And then, of course, the Pistols came along. When we first started playing, Joe Strummer from The Clash had a band called the 101ers, and they were this raggedy old pub rock band. You know, Joe had long hair, flared trousers, which I'm sure he did his best to cover up in later years. And he used to come in like with this manky old dog on a rope. And the best example of punk I can give you actually from back then is we got a bit of money together and we bought a couple of onstage monitors from Dr. Feelgood. They'd blown, they didn't work, but the Feelgoods hadn't told us that. They just flogged them to us. And they made this sort of buzzy noise. I remember Joe and the 101ers coming on to soundcheck. It was at a venue called the Nashville in London, the Nashville Rumours, which was a big catalyst for all the kind of pub rock and then punk rock thing. And he said, "What are those boxes? I can hear myself. I can actually hear myself sing." And Barry asked him, he said, "Well, they're monitors, Joe. They're great, aren't they? They make a noise. You know, our guitar's got all these blimmin' big boxes. Now I've got a couple of boxes." And the next week, because we had this residency at the Nashville, and the 101ers were supporting us every week. And next week, Joe turned up with these 2 Jaffa orange crates with a couple of like 8-inch speakers screwed into them. And he'd stand sort of monitor on them in case somebody thought they were a couple of bits of old crap and shut them away with these wires coming out. That was the best example of DIY punk I can probably give you.
Now, was this the same place where I believe Sex Pistols opened for you guys? And
that was the Marquee.
That was the Marquee. Okay. I heard a story where they opened for the Hot Rods and they ended up smashing your gear. Is that correct?
That's true. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one. We think that our manager, Ed Hollis, and Mark McLaren got their heads together to create a story to sort of try and make the front page of the music papers. They were both operators, which they did. But I was standing at the side of the stage when the Pistols were on, and I saw McLaren shouting instructions to the band. "Johnny, kick over that monitor. Steve, knock that mic into the audience." You know, it was choreographed. The whole thing was choreographed. And we didn't know about it. And we were never told that was going to happen. And they did some damage. And I think Barry went up and confronted Johnny afterwards and gave him a bit of a slap or something. But anyway, it was kind of blown out of all proportion. And it made the front page of, I don't know which it was, Sounds or Enemy the week after. And I have to say, it certainly worked for the Pistols because, you know, coming up just before their London weekend television performance, you know, it kind of put them on at the forefront of everything. But it wasn't quite as over the top as the press made it out. You know, as usual, the press kind of took what was an ant and made it into, you know, a molehill.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of it was manufactured, much of it at the hand of Malcolm McLaren anyway.
Yeah. I mean, he was an operator. And the same with Bernie Rhodes, you know, the Clash's manager.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's not forget, you know, both those bands, for all their so-called, you know, punk stuff, they both signed to absolutely major record labels, you know, and the very corporate companies that they were kind of railing against, which is an interesting one.
Did the bands all get along well? Like, did you guys get along with the Pistols or even AC/DC, who was around at the time? Was it a tight community? Or?
Not the Pistols. I always liked Glenn. We got on well with Glenn. You know, he was a musician. We had conversations about ABBA together in later years. Mm-hmm. You know, he's a big ABBA fan as I am. But the others, you know, it was all an act, and I didn't warm to them at all. The band I always liked right from the get-go was The Damned. And you mentioned AC/DC. Mm-hmm. There was another pub. You know, back then, Nate, there was all these fantastic venues that, you know them, the Hope and Anchor, the Red Cow, the Marquee, the Nashville, that all the bands played in, all long gone now, sadly. And there was this one in Hammersmith called the Red Cow, tiny little pub. And AC/DC had just come over to Britain. And one week we'd play the Red Cow and we kind of get 40 people in. The next week AC/DC would get 50 people in. Next week we get 60. And it went like this. You know, we were both pub rock bands, and then we both progressed to the Marquee at the same time. And the same thing went on there. You know, each week we kind of took in turns to play, and each week we get another sort of dozen or 50 punters in or something. It was really interesting. And the same with Dire Straits, you know, all these bands that became absolutely mega, all kind of started off the Police, you know, at the same time, playing the same pubs to 50 people and a dog. It all kind of happened. There was so much happening in a short space of time. We kind of new wave, pub rock, punk rock. It was a whirlwind. And so I think that's another reason why I didn't maybe fully appreciate what was going on. There was so much going on. And with the Hot Rods, we were kept busy all the time. We weren't touring, we were recording. I can't say we weren't recording, we were rehearsing, because we never rehearsed. We just sort of rehearsed when we got in the studio or in the pub talking about it, you know. So it was a 6-month period, really, where there was this sort of massive catalyst of change and everything exploded at the same time.
Wow. I'd love to have a time machine and go back there.
You know, I'd love to have a time machine and go back there as an observer.
Yeah.
And then I'd have said, God, I wish I was part of that. You know, I read this stuff back and I think, yeah, I was a part of that. Oh, no, Paul, that's your name there. That's your picture there. And it's almost kind of like looking back from another plane, you know, or an alternate universe. That was me, but it didn't actually seem like it was me at the time. Does that make sense? It's a weird thing to say.
Yeah, no, totally. It's almost like, you know, disbelief that you were there and you played this central character in quite an interesting historical era.
You've nailed it.
So the Hot Rods signed to Island Records. What was the story about getting that record deal? Was there a lot of competition for the Hot Rods?
We had a lot of A&R people down. I was just 17 then. The other guys were only a couple of years older. The oldest guy was Dave, who I think was 5 years old. He was 23. Mm-hmm. We did it because we loved playing, and it was really an excuse to get free beers, if I'm quite honest. Nobody had any thoughts about record deals or becoming successful, perhaps apart from our manager. And our manager, Ed, knew nothing about managing. He had the biggest collection. He had 2 nicknames, Hot Wax and 1,000 Eddie, because he lived in this caravan on Canvey Island, and he had 1,000 albums in this caravan. Nothing else. There was a kettle in there, a 2-ring cooker, and 1,000 albums, and a record deck, records everywhere. And we'd go back after going to the pub or whatever, and go back until 2 or 3 in the morning, and he'd fish out album after album, and he'd tell you not, you know, the band, the song. He'd have told you who wrote it, who engineered it, who produced it. He probably told you, you know, who the A&R man was. He knew everything. He had this absolute encyclopedic knowledge, and it was him that introduced us, or me anyway, to all those wonderful sort of 60s bands like the Seeds and the Blues Magoos, you know, the Nugget stuff, the MC5, Television. And he'd pick all this stuff out. And then the next track would be like a Burning Spear track, or the next track would be Noi. And there was no rhyme or reason to it, but he'd exclaim, listen to this, it's fucking brilliant. Every song he played, he'd say, it's fucking brilliant. And he was such an enthusiastic lover of music. That's what kind of, I think, got him into the record companies. He was like a whirlwind. He'd breeze in. People respected him because he knew his musical history, didn't know about the business. He learned that on the fly, which wasn't always in our best interest, I have to say in hindsight. But yeah, so we start getting A&R people within 2 months of playing London, you know, extraordinary to think that would happen back then. But of course, it was all new, and A&R people always want to be on the newest thing. Nearly all of them would be in suits. So, of course, they invoked, you know, our ire straight away, you know, what people in suits coming to see us for, you know, and they talk business, and we tend to take the piss out of them and try and get them to buy us more beers. And we signed with Iron Records, and this is no word of a lie, we signed with Iron Records because Howard Thompson, who is a fantastic A&R guy, he bought us the most beers, and it was at the Nashville. I think he bought us 7 rounds of beers in one night, and they kept coming up on these trays flowing. And we thought, that's the sort of record company we'd like to be with. And he was only a few years older than us. And he also had a massive record collection like Eddie. So the two of them would be standing at the back of the bar discussing all these, you know, weird and wonderful and rare and upcoming and new import records. Well, we'd be putting it to sleep. Go on now, buy us another beer. And so he kept us both happy. And he fulfilled the very simple criteria that we wanted, that a record company that wasn't stuffy and we could sort of speak to. And our manager liked that he could actually sit down and talk to him about all these groups that no other A&R people knew about. They were just kind of stuck in their, you know, their corporate record company rut. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting one. And Howard was very, really helped us in the early days. He came on tour with us. He then left, ended up running Elektra in New York. He worked with, I can't even remember all the bands he worked with and signed, but, you know, the list is as long as your arm. And we're still in touch. In fact, he came over to Canvey. We did a kind of a reunion gig when Dave Hicks died about 5-6 years ago on Canvey. And he flew all the way from New York, where he lives now, unannounced, and turned up at this little pub on Canvey, which is a really sweet thing to do, you know.
Yeah. Did he still buy you all those beers?
He did.
Was the tab still open?
Well, I just had throat cancer, so I couldn't drink, unfortunately. But he did, yeah. And he was as enthusiastic and, you know, great as he'd always been. So, yeah, there was no great grand plan. You know, there was nothing was planned with the Hot Rods in much the same way as nothing was really planned with the Damned. It was just, this is great fun, isn't it? We're playing, you know, this great music. We're getting away with it. People are paid to see it, and we're getting all these free beers. What's not to love? Let's see how long we can keep it going for, because it all could go pear-shaped tomorrow. That was really it.
So when you recorded Teenage Depression, did it sound like you guys wanted it to sound? Were you proud of the end result? Were you happy with what you did?
That album was recorded in 2 days flat with a guy called Vic Mail, who, funny enough, he produced The Space Ritual. He'd also done Live at Leeds, which I didn't know at the time, and he'd done the first Feel Goods album. So he had a good pedigree, a lovely little studio in Rickmansworth, which is about 10 miles outside North London. And I didn't know, you know, I'd never been in a studio before. I don't think anybody had, to be quite honest. So we didn't really know what to expect. It's all recorded live, all recorded pretty much first take, minimum of overdubs. There's plenty of mistakes on there from everybody, but it goes back to that thing. It doesn't matter because it was kind of a breath of fresh air. It's a spirited album. It's a pretty one-dimensional album, apart from there's quite a long kind of almost psychedelic track called On the Run on there, which was Dave Sigg's kind of, I think, acid masterpiece or acid flashback masterpiece. But the rest of it was kind of like, 2-minute, 50-second blitzes of full on high energy rock and roll, which coincidentally the Ramones were doing in New York, unbeknownst to us, at exactly the same time.
At the same time.
And it's kind of weird, isn't it? And the Damned were doing it a little bit after us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But all these none of us really knew what each other were doing, but there was this groundswell that suddenly came together at the same time, that became this kind of crazy thing called punk. And it must have been a joint rebellion against, all that stadium rock stuff that, I mentioned earlier on.
The backlash of all the quote unquote intelligentsia rock.
Yeah, I don't think it was a conscious backlash. It wasn't let's get rid of this. It was more like, yeah, well, okay, you played that 10-minute solo. I've gone to sleep. What's going to be next? It lacked excitement, didn't it? It lacked excitement. It was all very kind of muso and safe and predictable. And
there was no spontaneity
because there wasn't much else at the time. After the glam rock thing kind of finished.
Now, with Eddie and the Hot Rods, there's one particularly rare record, the 7-inch of Writing on the Wall. There's a picture sleeve. I don't know if you have one of these in your collection, but if you do, it tends to go for about 500 pounds or more.
Right. Tell me what it is. I've got to look now.
I will literally send you the details of it. Yeah, there's a 7-inch picture sleeve, Writing on the Wall. I forgot what's on the other side, but yeah, if you find one of those, then maybe you could buy the beers for Howard the next time.
On the wall.
Yes.
Do you know? I think is it yellow?
No, it's a picture sleeve. I believe it's blue.
I'll have a look after we finished chatting, Nate.
I'll send you a picture. Right.
Okay. What our manager did, what Ed did, he was very much of a similar mindset as Jake Riviera, who masterminded all the Stiff Records thing.
Right.
In that he foresaw the collectability of badges and ephemera, what the word is, stuff surrounding
stuff.
Yeah, product, stuff. That's it, stuff. And different picture sleeves, different prints, supposed misprints, as in the hot rods on the back of the damn thing. Mm-hmm. All this stuff they both foresaw as being eminently collectible at some point in the future. Didn't know when that was, but boy, have they been proven right. I've got boxes upstairs of pin badges from back in the day. I love badges. Everybody loved badges back then. Mm-hmm. All the collections of stuff. And it's kind of a shame that all that's gone because it kind of brought you closer to the bands. And that whole collectability thing seems to have disappeared, perhaps along, with the rise of all the digital stuff, the Spotify's, the Amazon and all of that.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a shame because that stuff is what kind of made you loyal to a band. Like you might be loyal to, a football or rugby or a baseball team or something. Mm-hmm. You built up your allegiance, didn't you, to a band for all this stuff?
Well, in a similar way, how punk was a rebellion against a lot of the prog rock and that sort of thing. There's a lot of people, myself included, who really enjoy physical form media music. So streaming, it has its place, but I only feel that I have the music when I own a physical copy of it. And records and those sort of things have been making a huge comeback over the last 10 years because I think people are just sick of not being able to have it. They enjoy the ritual and holding things and, really having an object rather than something that they just plug in and get.
It's tactile, isn't it? It's that.
There's quite a bit.
It's that touch thing and
tactile. It's the smell.
Yeah.
It's the experience. I also think a lot of it is the ritual. Like, I used to have a lot of CDs, but I only knew the first 4 songs. And it was probably because my brain just started tuning out after a certain amount of time. Whereas with the record, you have to stop it, you have to flip it, you kind of reset things.
Exactly.
So it's, yeah.
You pay more attention to it, don't you? You get immersed in it because there's all those little details in the artwork. You read through, or at least I, read through every bit of information about who did what on it, which maybe is one of Ed's legacies, who the engineer was, who the photographer was. Oh, God, who are those people that are being thanked on the back sleeve in a small print? I wonder who they are.
Yeah.
It was all a bit of a mystery in your mind, sort of, you ticked over it as you were listening to the music. And it was that immersive experience that's one of the reasons that, both with Professor and Madman and the Damned and the Sensible Grey Cells, we're doing really good, thick quality vinyl, colored vinyl. We're doing the heavy duty sleeves. We're putting all the info on it. And with the Sensible Grey Cells, we're doing a run of even 100 cassettes of the album because we thought, well, why not?
Sure.
We're doing vinyl, so let's do the whole kind of kibosh. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, you read through the lyrics, and it's a journey, isn't it? You set time aside to play a record. You don't set time aside to play something on Spotify or Amazon or Google Play, whatever. At least I don't.
Right.
It's almost supermarket music on in the background, lift music. And music to me shouldn't be that. Music, you should immerse yourself in it. It should take you over. It should be, an immersive experience where you get lost for 30 minutes or an hour or so. Not something that's just sort of there in the background, which is really, I think, what it's become.
100% agree. I also think a record allows the experience to be shared. Like you can't, listen to someone's phone. Obviously, it's a very isolating experience. But with a record, you could have different people there. You could talk about it. You can say, "Oh, let's try this." You could listen to a side and then get another side of a different record. So it could become a communal thing.
Absolutely, bang on, mate. Yeah.
So with Eddie and the Hot Rods and that Damned picture sleeve, Rat mentioned something about this as well. Jake Riviera, he suspects that Jake was behind that Eddie and the Hot Rods picture on the back of the Damned record. That sounds like you agree with that, yeah?
I do. It was actually the two managers. It was Jake and Ed. And it was a photographer called Michael Beale, who was a great friend of both bands, long since departed this mortal coil, unfortunately. But Michael was great. He'd be up front at all the kind of the gigs of the day. And myself and Steve Hot Rod's drummer spent year and a half pretty much living in his flat in Hammersmith when the Hot Rods started off. And he'd introduce us. The other guy that lived in the flat was a guy called Larry DeBay. And he started Skydog Records. Are you aware of them?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. Well, they released their label in Paris, started by Larry and this guy called Mark Zamatti. And they put out the first ever Motorhead single, Leaving Here, the first groovy stuff. They put out something by Wayne Kramer from the MC5. And Larry started this shop called Bizarre Records in Paddington. And that was the first shop in the UK to get in all the American imports, all the kind of the Patti Smith stuff and the Ramones and Television and all of that. And so, we go back to their flat at night and we'd be introduced to all this music before anybody else had actually kind of heard it in Britain. And Michael was friends with Jake. He took a lot of photos of the Damned, obviously great friends with us and our manager, Ed. And Ed and Jake, Michael was doing a Hot Rods photo session and we were just pissing about. And somebody said, "Oh, do a rat thing, with the teeth and the claws and everything." So we did it. And I think Ed, our manager, saw it, cooked up this thing with Michael Beale and Jake Riviera. And it goes back to what I just said about this collectability mindset. How can we maximize interest for both our acts? I know, let's put a photo of one of them on the record of another one and say it's a mistake, that'll become collectible. Everybody will want to own it. They still do. That thing goes for 40.
That's $1,000 record.
44 years later, man, 43 years later. That shows how visionary they were. So, yeah, that's absolutely right. It was a thing to sort of try and raise interest of both bands. They got that little sticker put on the back, erratum, I don't know how many copies were pressed up. They say 500. I suspect there may have been rather more.
I heard it was 2,000 is the...
Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, that's lost in the mist of time. But
did the bands know? Were you guys in on it?
I can't remember. It was probably mentioned when we were probably all hideously out of it one night, and then we forgot. Yeah, I'm sure it was mentioned. But around that time, Nate, so many things were mentioned. It was just this melting pot of ideas, and your brain spun. It couldn't possibly, my brain couldn't assimilate everything that was going on. So it's entirely possible they said, we're going to do this, but it was one of those things that probably went in one ear and out the other.
I understand there's a rumor Linda McCartney sang background on the Thriller album in '79. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's not a rumor. She's credited on the back of it.
Is she? Okay. I haven't been able to find a physical copy to see.
Yeah. We did it in Abbey Road. We recorded it with this guy called Peter Kerr.
Okay.
And in the next studio was Paul. I think he was doing some Wings album. And Linda gravitated to our studio. How can I put it? It was a bit more, let's just say it was a bit livelier in our studio for whatever reasons than Paul's studio. So she came in and partook of all the liveliness that we had flying about in there. And once we got her pretty out of it, we said, hey, Linda, go in, where you go on? You can sing, go and sing some. And so she was really game. So she trotted off into the studio and sang on a couple of songs. Pound of Glory was one. I think she might have done another one as well. She was lovely. And she said, it's much more fun in here than in Paul's studio. And Paul used to pop his head round the door to see what his missus was up to every now and again, and he'd do the eyebrow raise thing, and he's, signature 2 thumbs up. All right, lads, how's it going? Yeah, sounds great. See you later, And you singing there, Linda? Yes, Paul. All right, see you later.
You couldn't convince him to sing a few songs, could you?
No. Linda was great fun. Not the best singer in the world, but, she'd be the first one to say that. But she was a lovely, lovely, lovely person. And, we got Libra to do some harp on it, Jules Holland to play on it. If anybody was around, we just drag them in, say, have some of this, go in and make a noise on our record. And they usually would. So
Thriller was the last Hot Rods album you were part of, and then you joined The Damned. Who made the call to ask you to come and audition or join?
I knew Rat and Captain pretty well. Mm-hmm. I used to go and see The Damned. The Damned were playing in London in '77, and I wasn't doing some of the Hot Rods. I'd be there. I just loved them, everything about them on and off stage. Captain and I used to go out and get up to all sorts of mischief after the shows, and I go and crash at Rat's place more often than not. We got on, they like the Hot Rods, I like the Damned. And towards the end of '79, my girlfriend was working for Ireland at the time on reception. And these telegrams, I don't know whether you or your listeners will remember what telegrams are, but in the days before sort of email and mobile phones and all that, if you wanted an urgent message, you sent a telegram, which was, somebody printed on a bit of card and couriered round to you. And these telegrams started appearing at Ireland. Oi, Gray, join our band, you bastard. What was it finished? With The Damned of the future. We'll double your wages. All this kind of stuff. And like all bands, there's ups and downs. And you get in a plateau and you got really very high highs, and you kind of go down and you can have very low lows. And the Hot Rods, I think, we'd had our time. We had a good 5 years of it. Interest was waning in the band. We'd left Ireland. The people that really got us at Ireland had all moved on. We were sort of left work with a bunch of bean counters. The songs we were writing probably weren't as accessible as the earlier stuff. all the usual.
You had Linda McCartney hanging around.
Linda, yeah, she's the one that messed it all up for us. Cheers, Linda. Graham had left. We were rudderless, to be quite honest. So the Damned was still very much on the up. Damned were exciting. They were brilliant. And so I thought, okay, why not? Let's try my luck with the Damned, because I'd done one last Hot Rods tour of the universities. The audience were dwindling. The fun wasn't there. And the Damned looked like a whole bunch of fun. So I turned up. They said, yeah, great. Come along to Wessex. We're in Wessex for a night. Wessex was still is a studio in an old church in North London. And the session was scheduled from, I think, 11 o'clock at night until whenever. And I turned up there, and Roger Armstrong, who ran Chiswick Records, was engineering, or producing rather. And don't think Vanian had turned up yet, but Rat and Captain were there. Loads of booze. Yeah, great, get stuck into this, There's a couple of songs, and one of those was White Rabbit. And I think we recorded 3 songs that night, and it was such a breath of fresh air, and it was so stimulating on every level and so wild and exciting. I thought, okay, I'm in. And that was me for the next 3 years. It was an overnight decision, pretty much, but Captain and Rat had been behind it and been trying to sort of coerce me for, maybe 6 months to join. I think they foresaw that Algie was going to leave or on his way out. I'm not quite sure which way around it was. And, that I might be a worthy replacement. And I'm glad they asked me, because it was great.
Now, during this period, now looking back at it, it was a huge transitionary period for the band. They're about to record the Black album. Was there a lot of camaraderie?
Yes.
Was the band that you joined the one you thought you joined?
It went beyond my expectations, because they'd not long done Machine Gun Etiquette, which I loved and still love as an album. It was so actually not a punk album. There was so much different kind of stuff on there. Wonderful, great sound to it, wonderfully produced. Then we did the White Rabbit, which sounded different again. And then 6 months later, we're in Rockfield. And in those days, we used to swap songs about on cassettes. We had these Port Studio 4-track things. And the amount of songs that everybody had, tunes and bits of tunes, was phenomenal. And we'd not really had that with the Hot Rods. It was pretty much Graham Douglas had become the main songwriter. When he left, it was kind of down to Dave and to a lesser extent myself. And I think we both, as I said, become a bit rudderless. And with the Damned, all this new material started coming in. So once we actually got into the studio, it was like joining a different band. It wasn't like Damned. Wasn't like Music for Pleasure. Wasn't like Machine Gun Etiquette. It was like this whole new being had been created with the 4 of us together. And there was immense amount of experimentation that went on, which I'd never done before, because with the Hot Rods, we tended to breeze in the studio, knock it out as quickly as we could, and then get down to the pub. There wasn't a lot of talk about how the song should shape or sound, or how can we make it sound different, or how can we put X, Y, and Z on it. Whereas with the Damned, I think there's a lot of this came about being in a residential studio, one that was as free and easy as Rockfield, which is one of the reasons we went back there last year, is all of a sudden we were living together like a commune, really, 24 hours a day. All there was, it was a farm in the middle of nowhere in the Welsh countryside. All there was to write and record music. So that's what we did. We just spent all our time, apart from a few hours in the pub, of course, just experimenting. If there's a piano there, we play it, but we'd also think, well, what happens if we do this with the strings? There was tubular bells. Well, what happens in playing them? Why don't we shoot them with a shotgun? What noise does that make? Let's record a toilet flushing and then reverse the tape and play it backwards. What sound that would make? So it was this whole new kind of blast of creativity that was very new to me. And I think was probably new to the rest of the guys in the band as well, that we had a month to basically do what we wanted. There was no record company breathing down our neck, no A&R guy saying, hey guys, you got to make a hit album here. None of that bollocks. They just let us get on with it, which I think is why it turned out, as great as it did. And out of all the albums that I've ever done, that and Life on the Line are still the ones that I kind of go back to, just because there was so much of their time and still sound, to me, innovative and fresh and exciting today.
Oh, absolutely. I was just listening to the Black Album earlier, and it just strikes me as such a unique item to come from a business like you described. People are just trying to get in there, record songs and get out, keep costs down. But with the Black Album, especially with a song like Curtain Call, it seems like you were allowed to have this indulgence that probably very few artists had that opportunity.
You're absolutely right. And that was really all thanks to Chiswick's, that they let us get on with it. They had faith in us. We were lucky that we had a really good engineer, house engineer at Rockfield called Hugh Jones. He was, luckily, he didn't drink, so he was in control when we were perhaps less so. And he managed to get really nice sounds for everything. The poor guy went through the mill a bit because in those days, Captain and Dave were the night owls, and Rat and I were more sort of, live in the daytime. So we'd be up and sort of rearing to go at 11 o'clock, to put some more backing tracks down and what have you. And poor old Hugh had probably only got to bed at 9 o'clock after being up all night with Rat and Captain. So, we put him through the mill a little bit, but it was that sense of we didn't have to create an album to anybody's expectations. This is the Damned. We can do what we want to. Let's make a record that we want to make. And as far as I'm aware, that's the way the Damned have always recorded. Apart from maybe the MCA years, I don't know. I wasn't party to that, obviously. But certainly, the same thing happened with Strawberries. And when we went back to do Evil Spirits, it was the same thing. Well, this is the album that we want to make, irrespective of what anybody might have expectations of the album that we'll be making. So, there's very few studios like Rockfield, and so many bands have recorded there, and they all speak glowingly of it. That there's something about it that's just free and easy going, and it brings out the best of you, to kind of on a creativity front. Whereas if you're in a normal studio, you're traveling to and fro, it's a bit more like, can get a bit more like a day job. You got your eye on the clock, or we got to wrap up at midnight and now the producer's knocking off. You could be just in your prime, right, I've got the idea for this solo or this bass part or this middle section. And okay, well, should we do that tomorrow because the session's finishing now? And of course, that's a real damper. Whereas in Rockfield, there was none of that. If we wanted to put something down at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m, we could go and do it.
And has that changed? Because I know the Damned just did a new album there. What was it like revisiting the place of that creative geyser that was the Black Album?
The studio hadn't changed. Well, the studio changed a little bit, gear-wise, obviously, but the vibe was the same. The accommodation was the same. I hope they changed the sheets and mattresses. But the cows were still there. The horses were still there. The same people were still there, even though the daughters were sort of running it now. The food was still wonderful. The vibe was still wonderful. Everything worked, and we could still record around the clock if we wanted to. It was perfect, and I really, really, really hope we go back there.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear the new album. People can check out at officialdamned.com, and there's even black and swirl vinyl copies that people can pre-order. But real quick, and again, look, I know we've taken up quite a bit of time, and I do appreciate you sticking around to talk with us here, Paul. I want to spend some time on Professor and the Madman.
Yeah.
And there's so many other parts of your career I'd love to get into at some point, but again, I want to be respectful of your time. Professor and the Madman, the new album, Séance. when you recorded this album, from what I understand, you recorded the bass parts 8,000 some miles away from the rest of the band.
Yeah.
Is that an experience that you've just become used to being part of this band?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When they sent me the first tracks for the previous album, Disintegrate Me, Rat had already recorded the drums on. And it's obviously quite unusual to, normally the drums and bass are recorded together. That's the building blocks of the entire song.
Mm-hmm.
If that's wobbly or doesn't work, then the song doesn't work. The whole structure falls down. So it was quite interesting to get the songs in with the drums already down, irrespective of what the bass would do. Mm-hmm. That's not the way you're supposed to do things, right? Having said that, Sean, I think, had put a bass down, or a guide bass at least, to the track. So there was something for Rat to play off. But I think Rat will tell you the same thing himself. He doesn't really listen to the bass player in the same way as a lot of drummers would. This looking in thing. He listens, and I know this because I've read a couple of his interviews of late. He listens, he plays off the guitars and the vocals, which is actually exactly what I do. Mm. I take note of the drums, of course, and depending on the drummer and depending on the song, I will take the drums as the kickoff point, or I'll actually put the drums in the background and take the vocal melody or meter as the kickoff point, and or play with the guitars, which is what I've always done. Because funnily enough, nobody told me that a bass player should play with the drum. It sounds blindingly obvious, but as I'm I'm not a great singer, especially after I was ill with the old croaky voice. So I tend to quite often play in my head, play on the bass what I've got in my head. There's a melody line that I could think of as a alternative vocal melody line, perhaps, or, complementary to guitar melody line. So it's interesting that Rat and I both have got those kind of trigger points to how we play to a song. So when I came to play the bass, and they'd send me the drum tracks, stereo drum track by itself. They'd send me the guitar and vocals with a click, guitar and vocals without a click, and they'd send me everything, sometimes with the bass on, the rough bass or the guide bass or the bass idea that Sean or Arthur put down. Mm-hmm. So I could kind of mix how I wanted to at home on my laptop. And it was one of those things that instinctively, as soon as I started playing, I kind of knew how Rat was going to play. I kind of knew or anticipated what type of fill he was going to do, what type of bass drum, what kind of tom-tom beat he was going to do, which always happened back in the day. It sounds a bit trite to say we had this musical empathy going, but we actually all did in the Damned. I think all four of us did, and still do with the people that are in the Damned to this day. So I slotted in, even though there'd been 30 odd years perhaps since I played with Rat. It was like kind of yesterday, in that I was immediately familiar of how he played. I immediately knew that what I was going to play would hopefully fit. And so, because we weren't constrained by a studio clock and recording time and budget and all that, I could do take after take after take at home here, again, whatever other day or night I chose to, and figure out all this stuff that maybe I wouldn't have had time to figure out to, had we had like a week to record the album or something. So it's actually ended up working really well, and it's become second nature to me, because at the same time as doing Séance, we had lockdown in Britain here. We just got some of the backing tracks down for the Sensible Grey Cells album. So we carried on recording our parts at home. Captain did a lot of his guitars, vocals, keyboards, effects at home. I did some vocals, bass, a lot of the keyboards at home. We pinged the files to each other, sent them to whoever's going to mix the songs. And that, which is out, I think, about a month after Professor Madman album, it's all come out at the same time, was approached in exactly the same way. And because I got so used to it and enjoyed doing it, and because all our touring is down the pan, I would think for at least a year, which doesn't bear thinking about. I thought, okay, let's see what else I can play on. So I knocked together a very basic website called paulgraceonline.com, where people can get in touch with me, send me any songs they've got. If I like them and we can, agree a price, then I'll play on them. And I really like doing that because it's expanded my kind of musical horizon. And it's, in a way, it's how you have to move with the times. I could quite easily sit here and get utterly depressed about the state of the music industry right now, as we all could. Mm-hmm. And the only way for me personally to get over that is to get out and ride the hills on my bike and clear my head, come back and do some recording remotely that will end up probably getting used somewhere, which is great because normally I do some recording, it ends up on a computer or on a file somewhere, file under F for forget. Unless it's fished out to send to, one of the bands I'm working with. So an awful lot has changed in 6 months. And whilst I'm not a great fan of screen time, it does my eyes in a bit. I'm very basic with the technology I use. I only use GarageBand on my MacBook, but GarageBand is pretty much as good as Logic for recording bass and guitars. You've still got all the same stuff in there. It does what I need it to. And to me, it's the sort of the next generation step up from slapping a cassette in on a 4-track Porter studio. So it worked great with the Madman. That's how we're going to carry on recording. And it worked great for the Sensible Grace Hills too.
That is really, really quite inspiring because, here we've got this global lockdown that's pretty much hit the pause button on just about everything in the world, and most notably the music and entertainment industry. And you've effectively turned that into a situation where you've got 3 albums coming out this year now: Sensible Grace Hills, the new Damned album, and Professor and the Madman.
But the Damned's an EP.
Okay.
Yeah, the Damned's a 4-track EP, but the other 2 are albums. That's right. Yeah,
but still projects, still releases, and you're playing with musicians and bands around the world. So you're kind of taking the lemons and making lemonade. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I didn't expect to be doing that, but it seemed a logical progression. And I've had a couple of quite quirky and interesting projects in from quite unexpected sources. To take 2 extremes. One's a kind of very quirky new wave one-man band from Romania, of all places, that reminds me of early kind of type, I don't know, Sparks almost, kind of glam rock. And another is a guy from California, a guy called Craig Walker, who sent me this fantastic song that's got David Bowie's keyboard player playing on. So all this sort of stuff is kind of out there. And I think the longer, we go on in this sort of state of uncertainty and flux and not being able to do what we all really love doing, which is getting up on a ramp and playing. I think the more of this is going to be going on because musicians need an outlet for their creativity. If not, they kind of wither and, wilt on the vine. I mean, I certainly do. So it's kind of working for me. I mean, I hope I get loads more in. God knows I've got plenty of time to do it now.
Well, hopefully 2021 is going to be the type of year where you'll have your choice to do some stuff in the studio and go out and play some shows.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all those stories and those tales of the early days of punk rock. Again, it would be amazing to time travel back there, and you were there, even though sometimes you don't realize you were there. You were there.
Yeah.
And you feel like like an observer reading a book about something. But yeah, you're there's a few chapters with you in it there. I do want to remind all the listeners to check out Professor and the Madmen. The album Séance is out November 13th. You can check it out at professorandthemadmen.com. I'll put a link in this episode page, of course. You could buy colored vinyl. You could buy, I believe there's a black vinyl as well, but there's also a board game that comes with it. So we were talking about the physical sense of having an object and listening to a record and flipping through and reading all the liner notes. Well, here you could actually play the record on the turntable and on a table as well. Just some sort of board game. I don't know what it's like. I'm assuming it's some sort of Monopoly. Maybe you're helping Rat get around to the Marquee Club. I don't know what the board game is, but it should be interesting. You can order one at professorandthemadmen.com. And of course, you can go to officialdamned.com and check out the new EP, The Rockfield Files. So there we go. Paul, thanks again for coming on the show. Also, to remind people, you can get Paul actually playing on your track. Reach out to paulgraybasonline.com and click around, send him a note and work it out. And you could have Paul as part of your next musical project. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the Vinyl Guide, mate.
Love to speak to you, Nate. Excellent.
Okay. See you, Paul.
Take care, man. Bye now.
Well, there we go. The bass legend himself, Paul Gray. And there's a few different things you need to write down and know about Paul. Of course, you could visit him at Paul Gray Bass Online. If you're in a band, you want Paul to play on some of your songs, you could reach out to him there. I'm sure you could work out a deal, and you could have an absolute bass and punk legend play on your recordings. That's Paul Gray Bass Online. Also, check out the new album, Professor and the Madman. You could check it out at professorandthemadman.com. Again, there's lots of vinyl up there, special colors, different variants, plus a version of their new album Séance that comes with the board game. That's professorandthemadman.com. And thanks again, Paul, for coming on the Vinyl Guide. That's it for this episode of the Vinyl Guide. Thanks again for tuning in. Please share these podcasts on your social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Get them out there to the record nerds on your friends list. That is hugely appreciated. And we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, keep spinning. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Send your thoughts to Nate at thevinylguide.com or follow or tag us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. Until next time, keep spinning.